Thanks for joining us on this episode of the podcast of the History Teachers Association of New South Wales. My name's Jonathan Dallymore, and today we talk to Michelle Arrow from Macquarie University in Sydney about her new book, The Seventies, The Personal, the Political and the Making of Modern Australia. This is a fresh new look at a decade that many of us probably think we know well. And Michelle has combined research into the archives of one of the Royal Commissions in the 1970s with current literature on things like gender and sexuality and changes to Australia's modern political culture. This is a fantastic social and cultural history of our recent past that has important reverberations to things that are happening today. I do hope you enjoy this episode, and remember, if you like what you hear, you can subscribe to us on iTunes and SoundCloud. Here's the interview with Michelle Arrow. Michelle Arrow, welcome to the podcast.
Thank you. Glad to be here.
You completed, I was reading the other day, you completed your PhD in 1999, that's right?
Mm-hmm.
And so that makes it 20 years ago, I just realised. What is it that brought you to history and what is it that keeps you here, do you think?
Wow. Yeah. I mean, it struck me the other day that it's 20 years since I did my PhD too. And I was like, oh, I feel kind of old doing all that. But nice to have the anniversary of the third book on the, 20th anniversary of finishing my PhD. I got into history, I guess, in school. It was something that I really, really loved in school. I had some really good history teachers who nurtured that interest with me. I was always interested in Australian history. And one of the things I think that drew me to Australian history was kind of TV shows, like there were a lot of social history miniseries in Australia in the 1980s about the Vietnam War and post-war migration and Cyclone Tracy and, all of these things. And they really kind of fired an interest for me in social history. Also in watching things like Peter Luck, he used to do those sort of nostalgia kind of segments, but they were really interesting. They used a lot of newsreel footage, and there was something about the texture of that sort of Australian history as something that was around me and accessible that I think always appealed to me. And I guess in my family history too, I knew I had relatives who had fought in World War II and who had died in the Kokoda Trail. And, so I think there was that sort of sense of a personal connection there. And I could see in my own grandparents their lived memories of the Great Depression, so it was always social history, I think, initially that got me into wanting to do history. And I think when I finished school, I just thought it had kind of taken me a little while to work out that you could do a BA and that was about doing history at uni. You could do history beyond school. And so when I realised that I could do that, and looking at the handbook at Sydney Uni and looking at all the courses I could do, I was like, that's what I want to do. And I think partly it was being a child of the recession in the 1990s, and there were lots more postgrad scholarships available. So when I finished my undergrad and my honours degree, they were offering scholarships to do PhDs, and it didn't seem like there was an easy job offer for me out in the world. So I thought, well, I'll just do a PhD and then I'll see what happens, and so it's been a little bit of luck and good timing and just engagement, I think, with history. And I think the thing about being a historian is it's not just about doing the writing and the research, which I love, but it's also the teaching. The opportunity to teach history at university has also been something I've really, really enjoyed. So for me, it's just, I feel very, very lucky to have the job I do.
And most of your books and your research is social cultural history, post-war period. And this new book is really just about the 70s. So what is it about the 70s that drew you in?
Yeah, so the 70s initially was not conceived of as a book about the 70s. It was conceived of as a book about the Royal Commission on Human Relationships. And I'd kind of read about this Royal Commission, I think first in Geoffrey Bolton's Oxford History of Australia, the post-war volume, so 1945 onwards. Brilliant book, such a great work of synthetic, Australian history. And he kind of had a couple of paragraphs about it. And I was like, wow, that sounds really interesting. And most people I spoke to were like, never heard of it, don't know what it is. And I kind of dug a little bit further and I realised that there were records at the National Archives. And at that time, the National Archives had a fellowship that you could apply for to spend 3 months investigating material in their archives. And I applied for that to do this, find out what they had on the Royal Commission and got the fellowship. And so really that was then being the first historian to kind of open all these boxes, read all of these submissions, read these research reports, read the transcripts of the public hearings of this Royal Commission, and I thought there's something in this. This is a great archival find, and I thought initially that I was going to write a book about the Royal Commission. I went to my publisher and she said, look, that sounds great, but what if we kind of could make it into a book that tells a broader story of the 1970s but uses the Royal Commission as a main source? And so I thought, I'd like to give that a go. She really kind of put the challenge to me as like, can you write a trade history rather than a strictly academic history? And of course, that's an interesting sort of dilemma for a historian because, of course, a book has to satisfy those scholarly demands of the discipline. It needs to be a book with footnotes and, well-researched and all those things. But, she also said to me, write it like you're trying to, win the Stella Prize. Write it for a broader audience. And so I was trying to do that with this book. And so that's really where the frame of the 70s came into play. Using the Royal Commission as the kind of key evidence.
We'll come back to that commission in a minute, because when I'm reading the book, I was just so excited about the actual trove of documents there and thinking this is real historian's gold. So we might talk specifically about that in a minute, actually. Wonderful collection. And in the introduction to the book, you point out that often we think about, and I actually think I fit into this category quite clearly, we often think about the 70s in terms of the big political and economic narratives. Can you give us a bit of a sense of what those narratives tend to be?
Yeah, I mean, when I started doing this, and it's sort of hard to ignore in Australia because every November, November the 11th, we get this big reminder of what went on in the 1970s. Of course, the dismissal is central to the way most people remember that period. And it's kind of the memories of Whitlam that are tied up in the dismissal. And whether you were supportive or not supportive of the dismissal as a process, I think most people had a particular attachment to Whitlam that I think, is expressed in their feelings about the dismissal. And also during the process of thinking about this book, Whitlam died, of course. And I think one of the interesting things about that was thinking about the way the letters pages, the fact that thousands and thousands of people wanted to go to his funeral. People felt a very personal connection to that, to the Whitlam government and to the drama of the dismissal. And so that was something I thought was noteworthy and interesting about Australian politics, that I don't think people are attached to other national leaders in quite the same way. So there's the narrative of the dismissal, the kind of government, cut off, but also a government that gradually became mired in crisis, political crisis and economic crisis. And I think the other narrative of the period is kind of one that I think has been articulated and popularised by kind of popular political historians, economics writers, so George Megalogenis and Paul Kelly, which is that it was the decade where the kind of post-war boom broke down, where all the kind of pillars of the Australian settlement in Kelly's sort of sense didn't work anymore. Trade protection, exclusive migration, all those things started to fall away. So it was really a decade of economic crisis, stagflation, end of the long boom, oil shocks. All of those things really, I think, shaped this dominant narrative of the 70s as a sort of economic disaster area. And they're all written, I think, from the perspective of much more recent times, where I think certainly for Kelly in the early 90s, and I think even for Megalogenis writing in the mid-2000s, it looked like all of the things that had been brought in to fix all those had worked. The deregulation and all of those things and opening up the economy had worked. Whereas I think maybe if we look back on that period now, when we see rising inequality, environmental decay and degradation, maybe we would be a little bit less glowing about those prescriptions. And I think certainly that view of the 70s as a disaster area is used to justify what went on in sort of in the 1980s, particularly around, economic reform. So I was really kind of interested in, they're the two sort of dominant views, and I kind of thought that left something out. And I wanted to write about that.
So what does your book do differently then?
Yeah, my book certainly looks at the political and the economic, kind of circumstances of the 1970s, and it's certainly there as an important part of that narrative. But what I wanted to bring to the foreground was a gendered perspective on the decade, and really say, look, when you kind of say that the 1970s is just a decade of economic disaster and political chaos, it actually conceals another story about the 1970s, which is that it's this enormous array of social reforms where women were demanding to be heard and to be seen as part of national politics, where you see the emergence of gay and lesbian people as not necessarily yet as a political constituency, but the emergence of what we now would understand as a kind of gay and lesbian identity. So it's in some ways the birth of an emergence of a sort of identity politics, but also I think just more broadly a decade where we kind of took seriously the problems that people were experiencing in private life and kind of gave those problems political meaning and political importance. And that to me is something that I think we can trace right through to the present, something like the Royal Commission into Institutional Responses to Child Abuse, or ongoing debates about parental leave or same-sex marriage. All of those issues are now part of politics and kind of divisive and draw new boundaries in our political life, I think. And I wanted to bring those out and say, actually, if we think about the ways that contemporary life is very much structured around these ideas of gender and sexuality, the 70s is the period that makes that.
One of the things that I really appreciated about this is that, it's just good historical scholarship in my view, but you do set up really nice contexts, 50s and 60s, and you're saying there's already these trajectories underway. And then at the end, you also sort of point out that even though you call it a turning point, that the 70s left a lot of unanswered questions. Maybe we can just start with the context. How did the 50s and 60s build up to this decade?
Yeah, one of the things that if you think about the 1950s, the sort of stereotypical images, everyone went and bought a house and, white picket fences and all of that kind of stuff. And of course, that's a very crude and reductive view, but that's still, I think, a sort of broad commonplace understanding of the 50s. I was trying to suggest, I guess, in sort of thinking about the way that the 1950s sits there in our post-war life is we often think about, well, the 50s is prim and the 60s is, let it all hang out, and the 70s is something else entirely. But I was kind of also trying to say that, there are some little seeds of resistance and change in the 1950s. Someone like Barry Humphries creates, Edna Everage, who is a really potent satire of Australian suburbia. That's in the 1950s. There are, beginnings of organisation around Aboriginal civil rights, in the 1950s. There are some sort of beginnings of change around women and women's role in the 1950s. Certainly we shouldn't get into the idea that just because there's a sort of upsurge of feminism in the 1970s, that there is no feminism happening in the 1950s and no feminist activism. So, yeah, trying to sort of challenge some of those ideas around what happens in decades and how different or similar they might, be to the 1970s, say.
And so the subtitle of the book, it's the 1970s, how the personal, the political, it's the personal, the political, and the making of modern Australia. So I guess this is the central claim of the book, that it made modern Australia. What did it do to make modern Australia in the 1970s?
I think the 1970s makes modern Australia because it is a decade in which a whole bunch of new political actors are allowed to, well, first of all, they start to make a claim for a space at the table. The gay and lesbian movement and the women's movement, I guess, are the two that I focus on. But I think also, you wouldn't want to leave out the emergence of sort of multiculturalism and the kind of multicultural and ethnic politics that emerges in that period. I think certainly in relation to Aboriginal land rights that there's a new militancy and kind of agency in Indigenous rights activism. And one of the things I do cover in the book is sort of the ways that Indigenous women start to have a distinctive voice within the women's movement and within the Indigenous movement, and kind of owning a certain politics that are like, well, look, you're all you white women are looking for contraception and abortion access. We want the right to be mothers to our children. We want the right to keep our families safe and keep our children with us. So there's sort of a emergence of a emerging recognition of difference. I don't think the women's movement adequately did that, but I think Aboriginal women are trying to start sort of having that voice. But I think most centrally, the sort of argument of the book is that if we look at contemporary Australia, where we have, well, even at the moment, there's this contemporary debate about women in politics and women's leadership and how does politics best represent the needs and interests of women? And I think really that's not a question that was widely being asked, say, in the 1960s. That's for me one of the big shifts, is that you see in the 1960s there is the emergence of some progressive reform around, say, for the example, we could take two examples, abortion and homosexuality, decriminalisation of homosexuality. Now, in the 1960s, a lot of the voices that are arguing for those kinds of shifts of reforms, of the sort of clarification of access to abortion and of the kind of a defence for gay men who are caught having sex somewhere, so a kind of consenting adults in private defence. Neither of those have the people most directly affected by those laws as their public spokespeople. The people that are making the public claims about abortion are doctors, white male doctors. The people who are making the claim around homosexuality are straight white men. The idea that gender is a dividing line or that gender creates difference in public life is not really kind of taken seriously in public life in the 1960s. But by the early 1980s, it is. You have the Sex Discrimination Act passed by the Hawke government in 1984, the emergence of, new kinds of policies around childcare and those things. And really it's the kind of convergence of the Whitlam government and a very active women's movement that produces a lot of that change in the 1970s. And I think really from the 1970s onward, a government can't really ignore the fact that men and women might experience, things differently, and that women have maybe a different set of political claims to men. So really my argument about the making of modern Australia is that it's the decade in which these categories of people, these kind of categories of citizens emerge in public life and need to be taken seriously from then onwards.
So let's talk about the Royal Commission, and at this stage maybe we can talk about the archive of that in a minute, but just what is this Royal Commission, where does it come from and what does it find out?
So the Royal Commission on Human Relationships it emerged from a failed attempt to pass laws to decriminalise abortion in the ACT in 1973. So the Women's Electoral Lobby and other kinds of women's groups had really been, I think, and it was sort of recognised by the Whitlam government as being important to the victory of the Whitlam Labor government in 1972. And so by 1973, one of the sort of long-held demands of the women's movement was, better access to abortion. And in the ACT, so of course the government can't legislate on abortion federally, but it can legislate in the ACT. There's a big debate in Parliament, no women in the Parliament to debate this, to represent women's voices. Women form a women's embassy out on the lawns outside Parliament House to say we have no representation, in this debate. Long story short, there is no change to the law. That attempt to pass the law changes. But during the debate, there's a lot of debate about, well, how many abortions are there and why do women want to have abortions and what could we be doing better to prevent abortions and things like that. So kind of somewhere down the track, someone proposed a Royal Commission into abortion. That doesn't get up, but a Royal Commission into human relationships does. Because that was seen as being a little bit less politically charged and volatile. So they appoint 3 Royal Commissioners, the Anglican Archbishop of Brisbane, Felix Arnott, who's a kind of progressive, Elizabeth Evatt, who was on the Arbitration Commission and then became, of course, the first Chief Justice of the Family Court, and Anne Deveson, who's a broadcaster, very well-known broadcaster and radio presenter at that point. And they kind of go out and they ask Australians, what do you think? And the sort of terms of reference in particular are the family, social, medical, educational, and I think sexual aspects of male and female relationships, human relationships. So it's a very broad terms of reference. It's clearly aimed particularly around the questions of abortion, sex education, education for human relationships more broadly, child rearing and childbirth. But of course, when they start going and asking people about, abortion, they sort of talked about the way it sort of snowballed. So you would ask someone, well, why do you want an abortion? Well, I'm in a violent relationship. Oh, well, we better investigate that too. We better think about sex education. Well, there are some states that don't do any sex education. There are some that do a lot. We better investigate that. So it really became, as they asked new questions emerged, and it became a bigger and bigger kind of inquiry. As I said, people were invited to write submissions and lots of people wrote in. People turned up and gave testimony in public hearings. People were invited to come and give testimony in public hearings. There were open house sessions where you could just turn up and speak to someone from the Royal Commission about anything. Apparently they set up tables in shopping centres and people would just turn up and tell you what I think about, access to the pill or something like that. They also commissioned a number of research reports, into attitudes about sex and domestic violence and things like that. So it was a very, very broad-ranging social inquiry. And really this is at a point where there's very little sociological research going on into these kinds of issues. Really a lot of these questions were sort of in their academic infancy. And so the Royal Commission is often doing the very first sort of academic research in Australia on these questions. Domestic violence, they produce, I think, the first report into domestic violence in Australia. So it's a really big inquiry. It goes for, starts in 1974. End of 1975, of course, the dismissal happens and they don't know what's going to happen to their funding. There's stories they couldn't pay their telephone bill by January 1976. They get they're told that they must bring their report forward. Their budget's been cut. So they pull together what they have and they release their report in 1977. And then right in the middle of the 1977 election, a sort of section of recommendations that were sort of deliberately cherry-picked to be the most controversial. So abortion, we recommend there should be access for abortion for girls over 14 years old. We recommend the decriminalisation of homosexuality and a common age of consent, things like that. And of course it becomes a political football. Neither side of politics really wants to acknowledge that they had anything to do with this Royal Commission. Interestingly enough, it was established with bipartisan support. So actually both were responsible for it. But, kind of both were like reluctant fathers denying paternity. So Fraser and Whitlam, there's a great cartoon actually of the Royal Commission sitting as a baby, on the doorstep, and both of them are like, no, nothing to do with us, So it's sort of sad, really, I think, that the Royal Commission became politicised and sort of demonised in this context. And I think Elizabeth Evatt and Devison were pretty upset about that in particular. But of course, it's a 5-volume set of recommendations, 500 recommendations, and a really amazing kind of research report. And Devison also produced a book kind of popularising the research, and so that went out into a lot of universities and kind of became more popular that way. But it seemed to me like, apart from, the idea of establishing a Royal Commission into human relationships is a very 70s thing to do in some ways. But I think it also has a long legacy, in the sense that someone I spoke to who worked in sort of social policy, she said it sort of gave us ammunition on things. So even if you're sort of looking at the long tail of the Royal Commission and its reception, it sort of did give some people, I think, ammunition to ask for things and to make claims for certain policy shifts and stuff like that. So it's kind of an amazing, I think it was just sort of an amazing story that I wanted to tell in this.
Absolutely. I'm one of those people who'd never heard of it. And so I was reading with great enthusiasm about, just the stories of the story itself. Were fantastic. I just want to quickly read to you something that you've written in the book. It says, the submission and testimonies to the Royal Commission on Human Relationships are a fascinating window into 1970s Australia. When you ask a nation to tell you what do you think about everything from family life to sex education, you can hardly be surprised to receive a collection of responses best described as deeply eclectic and even troubling. Can you tell us now a bit about the documents? When you're in the archive and you're flicking through these things, what's in them and what's your reaction to them?
Yeah, one of the things that I think that the Royal Commission, and I think it's important to read the Royal Commission submissions alongside other things, because I think one of the things that they, it's the nature of the archive itself is to be skewed towards unhappiness, skewed towards, loneliness and alienation perhaps. I think if you're happy and content with your life, you're less likely to write and say, because I think people read what do you think, and it was kind of like, well, what's wrong? And I think for a lot of people were feeling alienated and displaced by the speed of the change that had happened in 1970s Australia. For example, a lot of women who wrote, because motherhood was particularly a focus of the Royal Commission, and so many women wrote and were like, being a mum is great, but it's also really hard. And, it's a 24-hour job. I don't get any holidays. And I would love some childcare just to give me some temporary time off. Or I love my children, but I also really love working. But boy, it's hard because the childcare situation is difficult. There were a few letters from people who were just really sad and lonely and just looking for someone to kind of maybe help them answer some questions about how did I get here, and that was troubling because you're just reading these sad letters and thinking, I don't know how the commissioners kind of wore all that, because I kind of feel like that would have been tough, Gay and lesbian people writing about the ways that, society discriminated against them every day, and really sort of putting those on the agenda as political questions, which I think is really, again, a powerful part of this strategy of the personal is political. They're kind of saying, when I went to hospital to have my baby, this is a lesbian couple, my partner can't come with me. She wasn't allowed to be there at this crucial moment. And, just things like that. They were sort of saying, writing to the state, writing to the government to say, this is a problem. This is something I've experienced. People who had experienced violent relationships and pregnancy terminations or, violence in relationships, I think was really tough to read, and I opened the book with a story from a woman who had had several miscarriages because her partner had kicked her in the stomach, and, you're reading this stuff and there were things in that letter I didn't put in the book because it was just too confronting and too upsetting, really. It's interesting thinking about how do you deal with the emotions that makes you feel, when you're writing this stuff. You kind of, it's one person, so it's not necessarily representative, but it's someone felt that was important to do that. Someone felt it was important to write to this commission and that they would get a sympathetic hearing. So I kind of wanted to take those emotions seriously too.
It must be hard. I mean, a lot of historians talk about this, and I think it's a common thing about working with archives and personal documents, but this is very personal and often very serious. So it must have been a heavy weight to actually feel like, I'm going to now select what to put in and what to leave out and so on. Yeah,
I think that's right. I mean, you have to represent what's there in a sort of way that is fair and respectful. And so I hope that, I think a lot of the things that I've drawn out of it are about problems because people are writing mainly because they feel that there is something wrong, there are problems that they want to identify. But I also think, there were people who wrote and said, I had wished I'd had an abortion and I didn't, and now I feel like I'm really glad I didn't do that, and my child's been amazing in my life. And, so sort of trying to, I guess, take into account the scope of human behaviour and the way that kind of gets, filtered through the archive. And also, too, it was interesting because they were private material in some ways, but of course people are writing it to this Royal Commission. So I didn't feel like it was ethically as problematic to use some of this material as, for example, if it was letters written between two people. These submissions were written and made available in the state branches of the National Archives once the submissions were made, unless you explicitly said you didn't want your submission made available. Some of them were made anonymous and some people did write anonymously, but some people were obviously quite happy for those stories to be made public. And again, that's part of the personal is political, that these people were kind of engaging in that strategy, I think, to make an argument about political change.
I really enjoyed, thinking historically, I really enjoyed the sections of the book where you do try to tease out some of the limitations of the archive as well, because I think the temptation on my part when I was reading this was to think this is just this trove, the complete trove of everything you need to know about these issues, but you're quite careful to say, well, actually it's kind of bent in this direction, there are these limitations, and this is what I can say from that.
Yeah, and I think that was always really important because, I've published some material from this archive in other articles before I wrote the book. So I wrote an article about the way homosexuality is framed in the Royal Commission and domestic violence and motherhood. And I think one of the interesting things when referees would read the work was always to kind of say, well, you have to be very careful about the ways that you make claims about the representativeness of this material. And I think that's why it was important, I think, to read it alongside other material as well, so that you could say, for example, this is a report into domestic violence. It has these kinds of key claims, that the Royal Commission is endorsing, but also these are the claims that are also being made by other activists within the refuge movement. It's also being, made by articles in popular magazines. So to kind of try and say that the archive is not a complete representation of this period, but that it can be seen in some ways as representative. And I think there are quite a few submissions that I probably have copies of in my folder that I'll probably never use, like that they're someone who has got a particular bee in their bonnet about a thing, and it's not necessarily something that you see replicated in other places. But also it was interesting for me because it was not... when I was reading all of the submissions, I expected that it would be about abortion, say, because that was the sort of key issue. But it was the stuff on motherhood that I pulled out first from my first article, because that was sort of something that was a real theme through the material that I hadn't actually expected, that there were so many letters disputing the idea of what motherhood meant in the 1970s. And again, that wasn't something that was explicitly part of their terms of reference, but it was something that emerged through the reading of the material, and it was everywhere. So that was also an interesting find.
We've already talked a little bit about Gough Whitlam, and I think he's a story that a lot of people would know well, or at least out of the people that I talked about in the book, probably better than a lot of other people. And I knew of Elizabeth Reid and have, when I've taught Gough Whitlam in the past, she's obviously been a character, but I did learn quite a lot from her. Can we talk a bit about her? She's the first ministerial advisor for women's affairs, and she sounds just like a much more remarkable woman than I'd even kind of learned at this stage. So
I feel like part of what I wanted to do in this book was to sort of really give her, to sort of not celebrate, because I think that's a simple sort of, and I don't think that this book uncritically celebrates her, but I think on the other hand, it does pay a lot of attention to her and take her seriously and really put her at the centre of this story in some ways. Certainly that middle part of the, looking at the Whitlam period, because to me, one of the things about writing a trade book as opposed to a scholarly book, this was sort of advice that I had read, was to think about characters and think about people that you can use to tell the story, to drive the narrative. And so Elizabeth Reid seemed like an obvious person to do that, because she really is the embodiment of the women's movement, what one scholar has called the fandango with the state. She really is at the centre of that engagement between the women's movement and the Whitlam Labor government. So as you said, she's the first women's advisor appointed to a national leader anywhere in the world when she's appointed. She was a philosophy tutor at ANU, kind of already quite a remarkable woman. She had been involved in various activist groups, abortion law reform and homosexual law reform in the ACT. She had a young daughter. She was separated from her husband. And she was kind of instantly seized on by the media, partly because there were no women in the Whitlam government apart from Margaret Whitlam, and Margaret Whitlam plays her own role, but of course she's not in the parliament, so she has a different kind of role to play. And Elizabeth Reid is immediately sort of seized on by the media as the supergirl, and, she's getting this supposedly massively high salary. She's a girl, of course, in the way that the media are presenting her. There's a lot of focus on, is she attractive? Is she not attractive? Is she a mother?
Not whether she's a philosopher or...
No, of course, and as she was sort of asked, oh, well, you mustn't really like children very much then. Of course, she's sitting there with her child, so she was either painted as this sort of super feminist or this kind of, like girl who just somehow landed this amazing job, But of course, she also is hugely important because she is the focal point for the women's movement. And the women's movement feel in some ways, I think, like she was accountable to them. And of course, the Whitlam government are like, well, you're accountable to us, you work for us, so she's in a really interesting tension between the women's movement and the Whitlam government. She goes on a listening tour not long after she it takes the role. She apparently received more letters than any other minister apart from Whitlam. Unfortunately, I haven't been able to find all of those. She kept a folder of sample letters, and that's where the letters from the book come from. But that, to me, is that would be the trove of letters I want to find, and I'm still determined to find them, but I don't know if they're there in the National Archives. It's been very difficult to track them down. But, people wrote to her, and I think because she was so identifiably a female in the Whitlam government, she's almost sort of like the women's minister. She's dealing with lots of people's inquiries. She's dealing with dozens and dozens of requests to speak to meetings and, open, shows and do all, kinds of activities on behalf of the government. But she settles very quickly on childcare as her kind of key policy priority. She decides that that's the thing that can do the most good for the most number of women. She has some luck with that, but of course there are also setbacks because 1974, the Labor government goes to the 1974 election with a really great childcare policy, but it all gets wound back in the kind of collapsing economic situation sort of throughout late 1974, 75. So she kind of establishes a beachhead, really, for women's affairs and the idea that women's affairs should be something that the government is taking seriously. And then in 1975, she persuades the government to put a lot of money behind International Women's Year, the celebrations for International Women's Year. And this is, again, the point where this question of accountability between the women's movement and the government comes up, because all these people apply for money, women's organisations, and a lot of them don't get the money that they've asked for. Now, partly this is because she says, look, this money's only going to go for 1 year, and if I fund your refuge with this money that only runs out at the end of 1975, where are you going to be at the end? You need to find a toehold in government. You need to find a place in the bureaucracy which will fund these new feminist services. But of course, the women's movement are absolutely outraged by this. And that sort of sets up a situation where there's a lot of hostility about her. And in the Women in Politics conference, there's again, the women's movement creates political problems for Reid and for Whitlam because they stage demonstrations at the opening of the conference. Whitlam is embarrassed by that. And she resigns within a few weeks of the Women in Politics conference. And partly this is because, she'd sort of become a political liability for Whitlam on top of all the other stuff that's going on for him. By October 1975, the whole thing's about to fall apart, right? So she kind of resigns, leaves the country. So it was a kind of way of tracing, for me, the sort of rise and fall of women's affairs within the Whitlam government. But also, as I said, I wanted to kind of take her seriously as a reformer and as sort of reclaiming that idea of the sort of femocrat reformer, because I think those women in the sort of historiography of the second wave, the idea of the femocrat or women who working closely with the state is sort of a very important part of the women's movement in Australia. But I think there's more interest in the sort of swagger of the women's liberationists. And I kind of think we should be taking those women seriously that engaged with the state, because they did try to establish some lasting reforms for women. And I think, again, that's part of this story. How did the feminist services like women's refuges, women's health centres, rape crisis centres go from being volunteer fringe services to something that we understand as government's responsibility to fund? And Reid is really important in that story.
You also claim in the book, and flesh this out quite a bit, that history, as in the discipline, made an important contribution to this whole transformation that's taking place. What is its role in all of this? Yeah,
so 1975 is, I guess, a particular focus in the book. I do a whole chapter on 1975 and International Women's Year. And one of the things that happens in 1975 is really the sort of first works of women's history in Australia published. Anne Summers' Damned Whores and God's Police, Miriam Dixon's The Real Matilda, Gentle Invaders by Edna Ryan and Anne Conlon, and My Wife, My Daughter and Poor Mary Ann by Beverly Kingston. And so really in the early 1970s, Australian history in universities, there's still not a lot of positions in Australian history. There's some Australian history being published. Humphrey McQueen's New Britannia is a kind of really an example of a sort of history that was very much informed by the concerns of that present moment, the New Left and stuff like that. But really, some of the key figures in Australian history that we would understand now, Lyndall Ryan, Anne Summers, they're doing PhDs, and Anne Curthoys, they're doing PhDs in history in the early 1970s. And so they kind of emerge a little later in the decade in kind of publishing works. But 1975 is really important because it's this moment where women's history not only sort of starts to be published in books as opposed to in journals and little magazines and things like that, but it makes a kind of public splash, I think, particularly Anne Summers' book, it becomes this sort of feminist bestseller, and it's a sort of interesting hybrid work of history and literary analysis and kind of more contemporary sociology, but it really makes a splash in the mid-1970s. And also I think people are starting to understand their history more broadly in the 1970s, and the rise of the period film through sort of really from the mid-1970s onward then really starts to shape Australians' popular understanding of their past. So Caddy is one of the sort of big kind of products of International Women's Year. It's funded by the International Women's Year Committee, also by the Women's Weekly, and it's this film about a woman who is trying to survive during the Great Depression. So a really interesting work of sort of feminist social history in the mid-1970s. So yeah, again, I wanted to bring some of that history and historiography into the story because it seemed to me that that's another place where you can sort of see the operation of women making a claim to not just a sort of public space, but to a history, really. And that's sort of happening in other places, of course, but takes on a particular kind of turn in Australia in the mid-70s.
When you're writing a cultural history like this, which is drawing on archives but also synthesising a whole range of other material, what kinds of theories and methodologies are underpinning what you do?
I guess I see myself, I mean, in some ways I was trained probably more as a social and cultural historian. I think in Sydney University in the, 1990s, that was sort of what a lot of us were doing. And I think it's interesting, my former colleague here at Macquarie, Sean Brawley, talks about the what's he call it? The Albury line or something like that, which is the divide between Sydney and Melbourne in the way that they think about cultural history. And I think, Melbourne has a much more explicitly post-structuralist sort of take, whereas I think Sydney has always been a slightly more, a softer kind of approach, I guess, to cultural and social history. So I think I'm interested in thinking about the ways that people articulate and understand their experience, and I guess that's a cultural history perspective, that the idea that we can recover experience in the past, I think, is probably, some people would say, no, you can't. You can only ever, recover the textual traces of that. And I guess that's, the sort of blending of cultural and social history. So I think I'm really interested in meaning making and claims making. So one of the things I was really interested in doing in this book was to sort of look at the ways that people articulated their experience and used that to make claims on the state. And that relates to a sort of broader ARC-funded project that I'm involved in here at Macquarie with some other colleagues, with Lee Boucher and Robert Reynolds and Barbara Baird. And we're looking at the ways that new ideas about citizenship emerged since 1969 through the languages of private identity and experience. And I guess it's not foregrounded in this book because I felt like that was probably something that is a bit less approachable perhaps for a general audience, but trying to kind of get the idea that, new ideas about what it meant to be a citizen were being articulated through people's personal experience and sort of taking a step back from that and saying, let's think about the personal as political as a way to understand that. Is a way to do that. So, I'm really interested in sort of reading documents and reading different kinds of documents too. So, of course, the book is concerned with those archival sources, the submissions and things like that, and kind of thinking about what it means to write to the government about being unhappy or being in a violent relationship, but also thinking about the ways that people use media and other kinds of public sources to make those claims. So, women's magazines. There was a great television show in the 1970s called Monday Conference, which was a bit like Q&A. They'd have a couple of experts on stage and then people asking questions, not just from the audience, but from the interviewer on stage. And the National Library has a set of the transcripts of that show. So reading transcripts from public events is also a really important sort of way to think into these, where are people making claims and where are people articulating what they want, from government. So reading transcripts of public events like the Women and Violence Forum that was run in Sydney Women's Liberation in 1974. So it was kind of, as you said, it's a synthesis. There's lots of secondary material there, and this book could not have been written without all of that amazing work that historians have done on the social movements of the 70s. But I'm hoping that I have brought something new to, one, bringing it all together in the one frame. So looking at the women's movement and the gay and lesbian movement in the one frame together, bringing the Royal Commission, which of course is an under-examined archive, and then looking at these other kinds of things and doing it through a trade history rather than through a sort of scholarly, strictly scholarly history, although of course it's got lots of footnotes in it, big bibliography and all those things.
I think we mentioned this before. You do call the 1970s a turning point, but you're quite careful to not sort of overdo that, I thought. And there's a real sense that this is not necessarily just a story of progress, and you even make the claim explicitly that sometimes a change is just that, it's just a change. And part of the latter part of the book seems to be this idea of a backlash and the limitations to the changes that are taking place. Can you talk us through those a little bit?
Yeah, it certainly was one of the gaps that I thought was worth addressing, which is thinking about, we all know quite a bit about what happened during the Whitlam period. Any of those books about the Whitlam government will have a chapter on women, and they probably put their stuff on gay and lesbian people in there too. But much less was known about what went on in the latter part of the decade. And what I wanted to try and do was to say, this idea of the personal is political. Like, yes, that was used to put some new issues on the political agenda. It was used to successfully kind of argue for new kinds of government funding, for new kinds of services and new kinds of forms of recognition. But on the other hand, too, it possibly unleashed some things that maybe people weren't quite expecting. And I think the sort of rise of anti-feminism and anti-feminist women's groups in particular was a kind of example of that. I was sort of curious as to the way that, by the mid-1970s and the end of International Women's Year and the rise of Fraser, you sort of have two things going on. You have this continuing economic kind of, really high unemployment, economy's not improving in the way that people understand that it might have. There's just the economic malaise is quite stubborn, and the Fraser government is coming in and trying to cut government spending quite dramatically, and there's a sort of razor gang that they bring in to kind of trim back things. And of course some of the women's policies that are established under Whitlam kind of hang on, and that's partly because there are women in the Liberal Party who are kind of pushing behind the scenes to maintain those. Fraser kind of says, look, I don't really want to have a women's affairs advisor in my office, directly. I sort of want to push that position to the bureaucracy, so it's not kind of directly within the office. But they also established this thing called the National Women's Advisory Council, which is designed to provide representation to a number of different women on women's issues, but it's sort of at arm's length and it's supposedly more representative. The idea with Reid was that, well, she's a feminist, and you want to make sure that you've got more than one woman advising the government on women's issues. And so in some ways I think that was interesting as a strategy. They certainly felt like they couldn't dump all of that stuff, which I think is interesting. But also I think what the National Women's Advisory Council did was it kind of in a lot of ways came up with the same sorts of things that someone like Reid was coming up with, but they were replicating a lot of the work, say, the Royal Commission did and the work that Reid had done. So in some ways I'm not sure of the effectiveness of that strategy, even though it was interesting that they kept it and built on it. But then, of course, you have the emergence of sort of anti-feminist groups as well. And these anti-feminist groups are kind of increasingly aware that getting a seat at the table in these advisory organisations is important. And also I think that they took advantage of the fact that the Fraser government wasn't really quite sure how to deal with women as a constituency. So you've got a group of women saying, we're the Women's Action Alliance, and they're like, oh, well, they're women. They must be speaking with the voice of women. But of course, they're sort of quite an anti-feminist group and trying to sort of wind back some of the things that had happened under the Whitlam government. And then later in the decade, particularly around the question of abortion and ongoing debates around abortion, you have the emergence of women who want to be women, who are a very anti-feminist, anti-abortion women's group, but also using some of this stuff around the personal is political and using their identities as housewives and as mothers to kind of make claims in the public about their representativeness as a group and making claims to try and, get the things that they wanted. So I wanted to, and again, I think it's one of the things that is new that the book brings in, which is sort of not just looking at the rise of the women's movement, but looking at the sort of emergence of anti-feminist groups. Really by 1983 and 4, they're gone, because I think the passage of the Sex Discrimination Act is sort of their last hurrah in public life. They all go off onto abortion activism or other kinds of groups. But the fact that idea of an anti-feminist women's organisation could work and could get political traction in public life, even though they were actually a very small group, tells you something, I think, about the ways that we should think about this sort of idea of the personal is political as it's working under a sort of in more conservative times in the early 1980s. So I thought that was important to trace those ideas through and how they could be used perhaps to undermine, some of the gains of the early 1970s.
We often think, or maybe it's just me, but I think we often think that when you publish a book like this, there's a kind of a donation of intellectual energy to the community, and I'm reading the book, I'm learning a lot about it, and I'm assuming most people who pick this up will learn lots. How about yourself? What do you learn in the process of writing this?
Oh, you learn how hard it is to write a book. Every time I think, I'm never doing it again. And I think I kept saying while I was doing it, don't do another one, don't do it. But already I've sort of forgotten. It's like having children, I think. You just forget. So there is the sort of, it's just hard work, and it just requires a lot of discipline, a lot of focus. You've got to sit down every day and you've got to do it, and it's just hard. But what else did I learn? I learned so much from writing this book, I think. As I said, it came from a position where I sort of knew quite a bit about what had gone on in this period, but I still learned so much, particularly I think around, the anti-feminist stuff in the late 1970s, and sort of thinking about that, the way that sort of economic conditions and cultural conditions sort of converged to sort of really squeeze out a lot of the sort of energy and optimism out of the women's movement in the late 1970s. I think also, what else did I learn? I think just that there's still so much that I don't know, I feel like. I feel like, yes, I've written this book that claims this is about the 1970s. I still feel like there's stuff I don't know. And I would love, I think there's still more work to be done in Australia on the histories of the sexual revolution in Australia. I still feel like that's something that we don't know enough about yet. I still think there's probably more to be done with thinking about that backlash moment and the rise particularly around sort of religious conservatism. So, I talk a bit about Fred Nile and the Festival of Light and anti-abortion politics in this period. I still feel like there's more to learn about conservatism. I think we know a lot about Whitlam. We know a lot about that kind of progressive, moment. But I don't think we know as much really about the sort of what happened in the period after that and the sort of period of backlash, or at least the period of reckoning. And I think in our contemporary moment, where I think we have sort of seen the forces of social conservatism, certainly around, say, the marriage equality, postal survey and things like that, really mobilise, I think it would be very useful for us, I think, to learn more about what happens in the late 1970s around that moment of conservative backlash.
I find it quite refreshing to hear you talk about how hard it is for you, because I sit on the outside sometimes thinking everyone else is finding it easy.
No, it is like this book was particularly. Look, no, they're all. I mean, writing the book out of the PhD is different because it's sort of it's there, and you just need to kind of translate it into a form of a book. But writing this, academics are mostly juggling teaching and research, and I'm juggling a child and family and all those things at the same time. And I think to sort of eventually, I was very, very fortunate. I had a period of teaching relief. So I had a semester where I wasn't teaching. And I knew that was the time when I really just had to sit down. And so it was, as I said, 5 days a week, sitting down at 8 o'clock, by 8 o'clock every morning. And I had a rule in my head, was like 1,000 words a day. You have to write 1,000 words before you can get up out of the chair. And, so yes, it's tough. It's incredibly tough because there is something about, it's an oppressive large, I think the oppressiveness of a large deadline and a large project, holding it all in your head in the one sort of space is really difficult. And thinking of it as a book, I think, thinking of, what was fun was the writing. I think writing a book like this where I felt like I could kind of, explore different ways of thinking about writing things. And it's probably not as trade as it could be, but I feel like it was fun to write in that way. The writing, at least, was fun, but the actual business of sitting down every day and doing it, maybe not so much fun. But, as I said, I'll probably forget, and I'm sure I'll be doing it again.
Well, I'm glad you pushed through because I really enjoyed reading this, and I know some other people who have read it as well and have really enjoyed it. So congratulations on the publication.
Thank you so much.
And thanks for sitting down with us and talking us through it.
It was a pleasure. Thank you.